Obviously, New Zealand is now, or we could safely say New Zealand is adjacent to a geopolitical confrontation, a kind of Cold War in one of the warmest parts of the world, the Pacific, as China seeks to increase its influence and the United States clearly reacts with concern. And the question for New Zealand is, what role do we play in this, and where do we stand? And for the first time, I would say, in some time, front of mind, we are being asked to address these questions. And I think Jane Kelsey, who has in her time been a critic of globalisation and sometimes a voice in the wilderness and sometimes ahead of the curve, she joins us now to discuss how we might frame this debate and perhaps give us some alternative ideas to the simple logic that most people have: China bad, US good. Jane, welcome to the program. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Morena, Sean, nice to see you.
All right, so we are suddenly adjacent to a power struggle, a superpower struggle, aren't we?
Well, we are, but I think we need to have some calmer voices than we've had in the last month or two. The notion of suddenly going and doing charm offensives up into the Pacific Islands countries, as some politicians here are calling for, and the Australians have done, is really quite insulting to Pacific leaders. I think we need to see their situation in through their eyes. For many years, our governments have really treated them like they're still colonies, especially in areas like trade, but also in areas like aid, where our aid funding's been designed as much to suit our needs as theirs. And I remember some years ago writing a report based on interviews with Pacific people, Pacific officials, over the then PACER Plus trade agreement that was called Big Brother's Behaving Badly. And it was it was really quite appalling to hear some of those stories. So I think a lot of this has been brought on ourselves of taking for granted Pacific Islands countries.
So you're saying we may have created the vacuum into which China moved?
Well, yeah, I mean, China now gives Pacific Islands countries options. And yes, its interests are not benign either.
Yeah.
And it has a different strategy, a different way. Its Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is about investing money, building infrastructure that works for China's plans, which are as much about developing internally as externally. And so they're not about to leap into bed unthinkingly with China, but they will make choices and they will use it as leverage against our governments as well.
Jane, I understand that you mentioned we shouldn't just run up there and say, oh, we really like you. And I would agree. That sort of charm offensive suggests, oh, we think you're going to fall for us, having neglected you, suddenly saying we think you're wonderful. It does seem disingenuous, doesn't it, if that happens? So I'm kind of with you that I don't think Nanaia Mahuta, or indeed this government, has to run around saying, oh, we really like you. I think that seems cheap, tacky and opportunistic, to be honest. But how do we, if we want to, shore up, broaden and improve our relationships with those countries which are literally our neighbours?
One of the important things I think we need to do, and this relates not only to the Pacific Islands countries, but what's happening with China and what's happening with the US and Australia now, is that we need to have a foreign policy debate again. We haven't talked about an independent foreign policy in this country since we had the nuclear-free and independent Pacific policies back in the
There's just 60s. Been an anniversary of that, hasn't there? Was it yesterday, the day before?
There has been, and that was, I mean, you're old enough, like I am, to remember, how significant that debate was. And instead we've adopted this sleepwalking approach where we think more export of low value added products is a great thing, especially to China, and that we can go down one path on the economy and trade and a different path on foreign policy. And we could do that when we weren't jumping into bed with with the US and rekindling that old Cold War alliance. But I think the Prime Minister, without a debate, has actually taken us over that threshold.
Oh, so she said USA good, China bad. Do you think that's the position we're now in?
I think we've moved from being more independent than, for example, Australia, which has had a quite hostile relationship in recent times to China, to one that has certainly antagonized China. And I think that also has flow-on consequences for the discussions in the Pacific, because it's going to affect the discussions that take place in the Pacific Islands Forum and so on there. But I think we need to take some signals, for example, from the ambassador, the Chinese ambassador.
Yeah, he's had a little brouhaha, hasn't he, with our government?
He has. And China is quite subtle in how it does its messaging. So he said, reputations are hard built. And there is a reputation New Zealand has built in China. And there have been benefits, not just in the trade area, but tourism and students and so on. And reputations can be lost. And I remember back about 6-7 years ago now, there was a foreign policy tension between China and South Korea. South Korea had backed a missile base being set up by the US. And all of a sudden, China's tour agencies stopped sending tour groups to South Korea. And inbound tourism from China fell by half. And that kind of messaging can go out really easily. Students, tourism, shutting down joint ventures or investments in China for fire inspections and so on. You don't need to slam tariffs on.
And it's not as if the US is actually giving us much for this newfound loyalty. They still haven't signed the CTPPP, even though I know you disagree with it. It's not like they're saying, it seems to me we've sold our foreign policy quite cheaply.
Well, of course, there is a deep irony that that Labor and opposition opposed the TPPA.
Which is why they had to change its name. So then they said, that wasn't what we were opposing.
Well, to call it a progressive is, we do distort language in the trade arena very directly. Yeah. But, this new IPEF, Indo-Pacific, we've renamed the Asia-Pacific to be the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as I've described it as a pig in a poke. No one actually knows what it is, except it will be dictated by the US for US domestic purposes. Yeah. So we need to have that debate. And thankfully, this might be the start of it, even though it hasn't begun in the right way.
Jane, do you think it is possible that in this time of heightened tension and geopolitical tension and this focus, which has been building for some time in our part of the world, that New Zealand actually has an opportunity to position itself as the neutral, honest broker between many parties? And that might be, rather than picking one side or the other, or a kind of post-colonial, patronising attitude to our island neighbours, maybe we could come up with a way to really play a very positive, neutral role in all this.
I agree, Sean, and that's why I mentioned the nuclear-free and independent Pacific before. I mean, we really helped lead the way on that. And I've been quite impressed with Nanaia Mahuta's quite level-headed approach, that one of the big issues for Pacific Islands countries is debt. And there needs to be some thinking around how to deal with debt. Climate is another issue, which we're not dealing with in this country either. We could change our position and actually play that leadership role and divorce ourselves somewhat from our Australian neighbour in this process. But MFAT will also need to change its position and its advice, because it's hugely influential in this process and it's pretty unreconstructed.
Well, and now, what do you mean for the non-tertiary educated people like me? What does that mean, unreconstructed?
It means they're still working on a kind of 1980s, 1990s model. Many of the younger people working in there don't remember the historical foreign policy debates. very good young people, but they don't have the depth of knowledge that's necessary. I think one of the things we need, and I called for this in a press release when this fracas first emerged, is maybe having an independent kind of wise person's review of New Zealand.
Oh, that sounds like an expert panel. And I'm just so worried about expert panels at the moment, to be honest, Jane.
Yes. However, there needs to be a stepping aside. This is not something that we should decide in the next 3 months. This is really serious. What we had with the PM in the meeting with Biden was major steps being taken without there having been a proper platform. And yes, it might take a year. It might take a white paper that takes 4 or 5 months to produce and a proper debate about it. But let's actually have that rather than opposition politicians frothing about, not going out there and doing the charm offensive. The Prime Minister entering into and Trade Minister entering into these negotiations with the US and so on. We need a proper discussion, and that includes working out our relationship with China, because despite the criticisms from some of us, we are now so hugely dependent on China.
Our largest trading partner, no doubt about it.
Yeah, the consequences of the backlash on top of the COVID issues will be really significant. So it's time for us to think like a mature, independent nation.
Okay, but I'm going to ask you a non-mature question, because I think in many people's minds it comes down to this. So New Zealand loses its sovereignty, someone's going to evade. Which regime do you want to live under? The United States or the Chinese? You have a choice.
No, we don't have a choice.
Well, no, I'm saying hypothetically you have a choice. You can live under a Chinese regime or a United States regime. Which way are you going to go, Jane?
We have a choice to preempt that, Sean. I mean, I've not only have I spent time in China and was deeply disturbed that the only time I had to show any ID was when I went through customs and immigration at the airport.
Well, they were watching you the rest of the time, weren't they?
Yeah, but I was also up in the US just before COVID hit, and I was staggered at the ignorance. I spent quite a bit of time in Washington talking in Congress, the ignorance there and the arrogance there, and that's before.
They may be dumb, but they're free, Jane.
I don't think we need to go either way. We really do, though, need to not sleepwalk into either of those options.
And do you think the Prime Minister took steps on that trip? And I guess you get wrapped up in being on the Colbert Show and giving the Harvard commencement speech. I guess she was quite excited. Do you think she knew what she did when she suddenly moved us by a quantum towards the United States? Do you think it was done knowingly and consciously, or just by accident? Because the latter would worry me.
Yes, no, she's an intelligent woman, and she's going to have had advisors there, even if some of them weren't able to make that meeting. But what concerns me is what discussions have been happening behind the scenes that informed that position. And those discussions have not been made public. And the people of this country have not been privy to those discussions.
Yeah, good point.
And that's what I think we need to be doing now.
I guess the big, event is the forum up in it's Fiji, isn't it, this year? The South Pacific Forum in Fiji? Yes.
And I mean, whilst that is going to be the big agenda item from Australia and New Zealand, who still remain the big brothers in the forum because they're the money bags, the biggest concern for Pacific Islands countries is the internal fallout from the Micronesian group over the Cook Islands nominee getting to be the chair of the forum. As opposed to the Micronesians whose turn it was. And so they quit. They said they were leaving. So there is this big internal split, and that is hugely important for Pacific Islands countries. Then there is the added problem for them that several of them recognise Taiwan, whilst most of them now recognise the PRC, China. And so Australia and New Zealand coming in and trying to dictate the agenda is just going to compound the problems.
Jane, I love what you said today, and that is we don't have to jump on one bandwagon or the other, and we do actually need to have an informed, policy debate. I'll be frank, I don't think most people in the street are going to want to go into the level of detail you do because you're an academic and you study such things. But I thank you very much for the perspective you've given us today, and actually you've given me quite a bit to ponder and think about in regards to these matters. I hope we can have you back on the platform soon, and thank you very much for your time this morning.
Nice to talk to you, Sean.
Cheers.
Okay.
That is Emeritus Professor Jane Kelsey. Interesting. So she basically says the Prime Minister went up to the United States and moved us closer to the United States at a time clearly when in our part of the world there is a geopolitical Cold War, warmish war of words looming, or war of aid funding looming. And maybe she says that wasn't such a good idea. Maybe the Prime Minister should have talked to a few more people and considered it. She also, and I think with some logical justification, says this isn't the time to be getting on an Air Force plane that'll break down, flying around the island saying, we really like you and we like the United States. Because people in the islands aren't stupid. They just go, you bunch of honky carpetbaggers, we're not buying that. You suddenly turn up after years because the Chinese are actually giving us some love. And you've been kind of ignoring us. I think a lot of what Jane Kelsey said is worthy of quite some reflection. And I like the fact Jane didn't come out singing, communist manifesto, reading the Communist Manifesto, which she is sometimes painted into that corner, perhaps indeed unfairly.